of the 1950s, the 1960s. We had our love decades, supposedly, of the 1970s and 1980s. Are we beginning this cycle once again of hate? And his criticism, and I agree with it, is the real problem is we've had these love-hate relationship with China, and that what we really need to do is some way to break out of this cycle and find a more normal kind of relationship. The problem is, how do we deal with it? Do we deal with what happened on June the 4th by going on like nothing happened and continue with our love, supposedly? Or do we deal with June the 4th by breaking off relations and moving into this hate period? Obviously, both of those approaches are counterproductive. And tonight we're going to talk about ways in which we think it should be handled or can be handled effectively. And we have speakers with very different points of view. So this will certainly be a debate. We welcome your questions and your challenges. But we're going to start out with Martin Wild, who is in the U.S.-China Business Council, has spent several years in China advising various firms on joint ventures and business in China. And he will begin on how we should handle this relationship. Martin Wild.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. What I'd like to do first, before talking about what we should do, what we, the American government, business community, people, whoever, should do, I'd like to say discuss a little bit what is actually happening in U.S.-China economic relations, since that's what I work in. And I would like to start off first, since the title of the panel is Business as Usual. I want to start by perhaps correcting a misperception that some people have. What is going on now is not business as usual. American business with China has been hit very severely by the political and economic fallout of what happened last summer in China. What happened in China, in short, has created a bad economy and a very uncertain environment, which means that, first of all, the Chinese economy itself has slowed down to practically recession levels. There's much less foreign currency circulating in the economy than there was before, so there's simply not the money to do business with. That's the first point. The second point is that the perceived risks of doing business in China for American companies have gone up considerably as they take in what happened and look at the slow economy and look at the political paralysis in Beijing and start to understand that this is probably not just 2 months and then it's over, but this is something that's going to, a lot of companies tell us we don't expect things to get better until there's a political change. So it's not business as usual. I'll just try to give you a few indicators of that. American sales, you won't see it in last year's trade statistics because most of the business that was done reflected in last year's trade statistics is from contracts that were signed before June 4th. But if we have 300 member companies, and if you ask them what they're selling to China, the almost universal response is that business, whether you're selling bulk commodities like lumber or plastics, or whether you're selling machinery, or whether you're selling instruments, or most of the things that we sell to China, business is way down because the Chinese economy itself is so slow and is being so deliberately slowed down by the policymakers in Beijing. If you talk to people running joint ventures in China, for the most part these days, such as Beijing Jeep or the pharmaceutical joint ventures or many of the others, what they'll tell you is that the lack of money, the lack not just of foreign currency but domestic currency, has brought many of their businesses to a practical standstill. Since there's no money being pumped into the economy, when they sell their products, they can't get paid, and so this one can't pay that one, and that one can't pay the other one. It starts to sound like what you studied about the Great Depression at the beginning of the 1930s. I mean, things have ground to a large extent to a halt. And I will add that this situation has changed a little. Some of you may have read that the purse strings have been loosened a little bit recently, and I think that's true. But compared to where things were before before 1989, it's still nowhere close. So exports are way down. Joint ventures that have been set up are experiencing slow sales. New companies are not investing in China. I mean, that's one of the biggest changes. You know, we used to have a flood of companies coming to us to say, you know, I want to get into China. It's the new market of the future. Tell us how to do it. And you know, that's how we did that. That was our bread and butter for, you know, a good 5 or 10 years. And that kind of approach to us has simply evaporated. I mean, companies, they don't see, they feel, and I think with good reason, that the environment is a very uncertain one. It's not the time to be putting money in China. And so if you're looking at new investment in China, I don't have exact statistics, but it's gone way, way down. The only companies that are making new investments in China now are ones that either had already made commitments or were so close to tying up that they figured, well, let's go through with it. But real new investments simply aren't happening for the most part right now. If you're looking at bank loans to China, ditto. It's not a complete cutoff, but if there was $2 billion of World Bank money going into China, just a trickle's going in now. There was billions of dollars of Japanese official financing. There's just a trickle. The commercial banks are going in for certain customers, but the volume of business they're doing is a fraction of what they were doing before June 4th. And you know, the Chinese are feeling it. I mean, they're squeezed for foreign currency. There are, of course, some exceptions. I mean, I don't want to say, I mean, to be fair, it's not a complete, I don't want to say it's a complete disaster. Certain sectors are a little bit insulated. For example, the Chinese airlines have their own sources of money from their international traffic. So the sales of aircraft companies, of commercial airliners are continuing to a certain extent. China's petroleum sector is insulated from all this to a certain extent. I mean, China exports a significant amount of petroleum, and a number of American companies had already committed to developing oil off of the South China coast, and those projects are continuing more or less uninterrupted. Very interestingly, and I also think very significantly, China's sales into the U.S. market have not declined at all. Indeed, they've picked up. And to me, that's a very encouraging sign, because if you look at where those sales were coming from, if you look at what China's selling to the United States and where the sales are coming from, there are two things. The sales are heavily concentrated in labor-intensive, but not necessarily low-technology products like textiles, shoes, toys, low-end consumer electronics, radio recorders, even telephones to a certain extent. Those types of products are the rate of growth is slower the rate of growth of sales of these Chinese products in the U.S. is slower, but the absolute growth is still there. And the reason the rate of growth is slower, I think, is because companies, I mean, they saw what happened last summer and said, my God, you know, we better be careful. We better try to diversify a little. But since now that they've actually gone back in to do the business, they're finding that business really is continuing more or less as normal. And the reason that's encouraging is because that business is not done with China's state socialist sector, but is done in the most market-oriented, reform-minded part of China's economy. That is to say, collective or privately run enterprises, many of them, in fact, most of them run by Hong Kong or Taiwan entrepreneurs that have come to China for lower labor costs in Guangdong or Fujian province. I mean, and the fact that despite what Beijing is saying about re-centralizing and taking control, the fact that that the localities are still encouraging this kind of business and are still able to make it happen is something I think we should be, I mean, anybody who's concerned about China's future should be glad about rather than upset about. I mean, and in a way, I think that's a metaphor for what our attitude should be about business. I mean, if you're asking what should U.S. policy be towards business, is let business happen to the extent that the Chinese environment allows it to happen. But don't, I mean, the business that's being done is good for the U.S., it's good for China. It's good to see some positive things happening, but don't think for a second that it is business as usual. It is not business as usual for the reasons I outlined, and it will not be business as usual until there's fundamental change in China. I'd like to conclude by making some comments about what U.S. government policy should be. I mean, I don't speak for the government, but I think it goes without saying that I think the U.S. government is by and large following this policy, although some of you may disagree, to avoid direct assistance to the repressive apparatus, to give special kinds of assistance to China only to the extent that it's economically justified. And I would point out to you, I mean, for those of you who think that the Bush administration has done business as usual, as far as the World Bank in China is concerned, it is most definitely not doing business as usual. As I said before, the World Bank has a $2 billion program in China. The World Bank itself wants to, I know this because we talked to all these people in Washington. The World Bank itself wants to restore this program as quickly as it can. I think for various reasons. I won't try to speculate what their reasons are, but they want to restore the program. The Bush administration has refused to allow any money to go into China except for very narrowly defined human needs projects. The one project is an earthquake relief in Yunnan province. The second project was agricultural development in Jiangxi. And the World Bank tried to push through a more economic development-oriented project, transport project in Jiangsu, and the Bush administration nixed it, and the Bush administration has made it very clear to the business community that it's going to continue to nix all but the most narrowly defined human needs projects as long as economically these projects are not justified when China is retreating from reform. In practical terms, what that means is no World Bank money for China, only a trickle of World Bank money for China as long as the Bush administration gets its way with the World Bank. That is so that is not business as usual. And you know, I hate to see U.S. companies not get the business, but I understand why that has to be the case and accept. The last point I want to make, and I'm being asked to stop, but I want to make sure this point gets out, is to maintain the framework of U.S.-China economic relations. Things are going to change in China, and we don't want to destroy the framework which has been so beneficial to both countries because of our love-hate peak of the moment. And when I say preserve the framework, that means specifically what is the framework? The framework is, in essence, China's most favored nation status. China's most favored nation status basically means that China's products are allowed into the United States market at tariffs, at the same favorable tariff rates that those of all its competitors are allowed into the U.S. I hope I've made that clear. China's most favored nation status has to be renewed year by year. The renewal's going to come up this June and July. I mean, it's coming up soon. The president makes a certification, then the Congress votes. On it, and there's going to be a lot of temptation to punish China by withdrawing MFN, but that would be a very unwise decision for the following three reasons. First, when you raise the tariffs on China's products, as I said before, the enterprises in China that are exporting to the United States are the non-state, many foreign-managed, progressive, private sector enterprises in South China. If you look at where the exports are coming from, $2 billion worth of toys, $500 million, probably half of the textiles, which is about $250 million, $250 million of shoes, $1.5 billion of consumer electronics. It is coming from the reform sector of China's economy. If most favored nation status is removed, the tariffs go up to prohibitive levels. They go up by factors of 500 and 600. It puts China out. It puts these Chinese enterprises out of business. The workers don't have a socialist safety net. You destroy the most progressive part of the economy for nothing. I mean, the brunt of the blow of withdrawing MFN falls directly on the part of the Chinese economy we least want to damage at this point. That's the first reason. The second reason is that Hong Kong has in essence, spilled over economically into South China. As I've already said, these enterprises in South China they're exporting are mostly run, and many are actually owned by Hong Kong companies. Employment of Hong Kong companies in South China is now greater than employment in these Hong Kong companies in Hong Kong itself. The U.S. is the main market for these companies. You take away the U.S. market, and that's what you're doing. It's economic ruin for these Hong Kong companies, and that's an unconscionable thing. That's an unwise and unconscionable thing to do at this particular point in Hong Kong's history with confidence as fragile as it is. Finally, it harms U.S. economic interests, and I won't go into the details. I think the U.S. would survive the blow of losing MFN a lot better than either China or Hong Kong would. But if anybody wants the details, I'll be happy to give those in question and answer. And I would conclude by saying that what the U.S. is trying to promote in China is reform. That is depoliticization of economic decision-making wherever possible. I mean, that's what's wrong with socialism, is that decisions are made in the political system when they shouldn't be. And it would be most unfortunate for the U.S. to set the precedent in China of making this kind of far-reaching decision for purely political reasons. Thank you very much.
Very strongly put. We will now turn to our next speaker, who will present a different point of view. Ye Yang, formerly of China, grew up or came of age during the Cultural Revolution, and apparently he says what saved him was that he was a good basketball player, and they needed a basketball player, so he was able to get an education of a sort. And he got a good enough education that he came to Harvard as a graduate student in comparative literature and is now teaching at Bates College in Maine. Yeah, yeah.
Thanks, Mara. Being the only Chinese on this panel, I think from the very beginning, let me make it very clear that I'm not here to dictate to the American people or the American government what the United States should do about China. We are talking about this U.S. policy, China policy. It is up to the American people, yourselves. It is up to the American government to make the decision about China policy. So at most, we can only make some suggestions, give some advice, express some hopes. I want to start by talking a little bit about the situation now in China. Not since last June, because you know pretty well what happened then. What I want to give a brief description was the situation since the second secret mission of General Scowcroft and Deputy Secretary Lawrence Eagleburger. You know the second mission was made last December. And what happened since then? Let me just give a few examples. China today, this government in Beijing today, is still a highly unstable, hypersensitive, nervous, hysteric government. And I can give you several indications. They just had this People's Congress, and they had a new Central Military Committee. Sometimes we have to look at those small events, small incidents, to find connections, to find meanings in that. And one thing which is remarkable is that all the members on this very powerful Central Military Committee belong to the Second Field Army system of Deng Xiaoping himself. You know that in the 1940s, the Chinese Communist Party, in their war against the Kuomintang, had 4 field armies. And these 4 field armies they were different systems. And even in the apex of Chairman Mao's time, even when he appointed Lin Biao, who was the commander of the 4th Field Army, as the vice chairman, as his successor, nevertheless, Chairman Mao never let any of the one particular field army cadres to become dominant in the military. This is no longer the case now. Now Deng Xiaoping has so little confidence in the army that he has to rely totally on Second Field Army, his confidence. Those people that he had relations with him dated back to the days when he was in the 8th Route Army. For example, this Vice Chairman Liu Huaqing, he was a secretary of Deng Xiaoping's when Deng Xiaoping was in the 129th Brigade in the 8th Route Army. And later when Deng Xiaoping came out again, that was the second time when he came out in the Cultural Revolution, when he became the General Staff-in-Chief. Liu Huaqing again was his assistant. So now this guy became the vice chairman of the military committee. The only one who did not belong to that system was a guy named Hong Xuezhi. He belonged to the 4th Field Army. And recently he was promoted, but actually purged out of the military committee. He became the vice chairman of the rubber stamp political consultative conference. He is no longer in the military committee. This might be a very small thing which might escape the notice of many China observers, but it actually shows that Deng Xiaoping has very little confidence even in the army itself, especially, understandably, after Ceausescu's death in Romania. The second thing I would like to say is that the whole of Beijing, ever since last June, has been in a high tension, especially after Ceausescu's death. Beijing, the Beijing city, which for half a year was almost like a dead city, suddenly became alive for a few days after Ceausescu's death. People were celebrating, parties were everywhere, beers were sold out, and ever since then, the Chinese government has to tighten its control. And now the situation is really what in Chinese they call 内紧外松, which is tight within, but apparently loose. Try to create a false image of everything as usual, but actually it's under high control. And you can read about it. Just a few days ago, the Tiananmen Square was closed down again because of the Chinese Qingming Festival, and it's also an anniversary of the starting of the movement last year. And recently also a very large industry outside Beijing called the Xingshan Irons and Steels. The workers there were planning a strike, and they were planning to come out and say, we don't want democracy, we don't want freedom, we want rice to eat. Because the economic situation has even worsened since then. And there is now, that's not in Beijing, but in the whole of China, there is now an increasing floating population, unemployed. And those of you who are a little familiar with Chinese history know what kind of effect a floating population can cause. A recent example is the Taiping Rebellion last century. But really, the Taiping Rebellion, to a very large extent, came from that floating population. The leader himself was an unemployed worker. The government now, even though we have a party secretary, some guy by the name of Jiang Zemin, he is just a puppet. All the strings are still in the hands of those old men behind him. So let's just have a brief look at those old men who are still in the very center of Chinese political arena. Let me just give you an age, a list of those people and their age. The most powerful, of course, is Deng Xiaoping, still Deng Xiaoping himself, 86. Peng Zheng, 88. Cheng Yun and Deng Yingchao, 85. Yang Shangkun, a very healthy, 83. Wang Zheng, 83. Bo Yibo, 82. Li Xiannian, a very weak, 81. From all these signs, what I can tell is that I hope the American administration, the U.S. administration, should not try to build connections with an aging, fading regime that is bound to fail the challenge of this succession issue at the sacrifice, at the cost of alienating itself from a younger generation, from the reformist camp. And I fully agree with my predecessor here, that the reformist camp, even though it suffered a lot since last year's movement, they are not entirely out. They are still around. Some of those people, like Tian Ji-yun, who formerly worked under Zhao Ziyang himself, they still have to somehow leave him there. Of course, a few came out. So it is important to bear in mind that this leadership in Beijing is neither monolithic nor stable. And you have to make a very clear distinction between the people there and the government. This brings me to my second point. I know the United States, in dealing with China, has two things to be considered. First is national values. Second is national interests. So let me talk first a little about national values. Before I talk about China, let me just go back a little bit, talk about the coming down of the Berlin Wall. Right after that, I watched Sunday with David Brinkley, and Secretary of State James Baker was there, and he told Brinkley and the other people, said how glad he was to have received a phone call from the West German Chancellor Kohl. And he said that before he talked with Kohl, he first heard the secretary. He had a few words with the secretary, and she said, "God bless America." And Baker was very glad to claim all the credits. And I think if there was one American who the Germans really was thankful in heart, it should be JFK. It should be him whose name is the very building where we are talking now, because JFK, Kennedy, was the one who went to Berlin Wall and made that famous speech, Ich bin ein Berliner. So America does have a national values at stake. America, United States, being a country of immigrants, being the descendants of people running away from religious inquisition in Europe, being the descendants of black slaves from Africa, being the descendants of people running away from dictatorship and persecution in all corners of the world, it is the beacon of human hope. That may sound a little pompous to you, but to many people in this world, America represents the last hope. And so it is very important for the United States to stand up for what it treasures most, the tradition of democracy, freedom, national interests. I agree with everything some of those defenders of the administration said. You have an interest to somehow engage China in talks about Cambodia, about the proliferation of nuclear arms, about the selling of ballistic missiles, and so on. Everything is true, except that this government, as I said, in Beijing, is not a government that can have peace with itself or with its own people. They did have a hope once, but after this massacre, when they used tanks and dum-dum bullets to kill people, it's simply impossible now for this government to make any peace with its own people. Simply impossible. And the only condition under which America can engage China in all those important international issues is to wait for a responsible government acknowledging the tragedy and making redressments for all the wrongs that had been done and gradually move towards democracy. Only such a government could be in American interests. And two other things that I want to say is that too often, much too often, I think, ever since the Second World War, I think the United States can boast very little about its Asian policy, with the exception of Japan, perhaps. I said perhaps. And I think one of the reasons, I have often thought about this, and I think one of the reasons is that some of those people, I'm not talking about American people, I'm talking about some of those policymakers in the administration, they never have in their mind a concept about the people. They always only deal with the government, the administration, as someone who openly claims that we have to deal with government, legitimate government who are firmly in control. And I think that was the reason why in 1949, despite the fact that the Communist Party at that time had the support of Chinese people, was turned a cold shoulder by the American administration of that time. And for the same reason now, I think, again, the American administration is not seeing the difference between a regime which cannot represent Chinese people no more than Ceausescu can represent the Romanian people, and a people which is now no longer like in the 50s, so gullible to all the government propaganda. Chinese people have now realized that they should hold the destiny in their own hands. So I think for all these reasons, no, there should be no business as usual. And if the condition in China is not improving in the next few months, we still need more pressure. And I hope I can have some time during the question and answer period. We do have something in mind. We think some steps could still be taken to bring about more, to have more pressure on the present regime. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ye Yang. In our next slot, we were to have a representative from the State Department, but we have a tale of woe for you. Our first, the first person we invited, the head of the China desk in the State Department, said yes. And about 2 or 3 days ago, we got a call saying he can't come, he has a conflict. They will send his assistant. And the assistant was very happy to come. And then yesterday, we got a call from the Public Relations Office of the State Department and said no one could come. We've been trying to figure out exactly why. I finally met this person who was the head of the China desk, and his explanation was that they couldn't come because this program was being taped, and who knows what would happen at the tapes. The fear seems to be that's another problem, but the fear seems to be that it's not clear what the policy is in the State Department. It's clear perhaps what President Bush's policy is, but the State Department's policy is not clear, and the fear is that it might conflict perhaps with the president's, it might conflict with somebody else's, and as a result they prefer not to show. So we're very sorry about this, but we are very fortunate in that we were able at the last minute to ask Robert Ross, who is an expert on Chinese U.S. foreign policy in the political science department at Boston College, and he was very happy to fill in for the State Department person. I don't think he's going to present their position, whatever position that might be, but he will present his position. Bob Ross.
Indeed, the views I express are my own and not those of the State Department. We've heard Martin say that business is not as usual. We've heard Mr. Yaz say they should not be as usual. We hear the Chinese say to the Americans, it's up to you to untie the knot. We hear the Americans say back to the Chinese, You're the one who killed 2,000 people on June 4th. You untie the knot. I can think of a lot of good reasons to untie the knot. 3 wars in Asia in the last 50 years, a lot of dead people. And China's been at the center of every one of those conflicts. There are people dying right now in Cambodia. Remember Pol Pot? He's still killing people. And China's at the center of that conflict. Mr. Yan mentioned America has national interest. We have national values. Martin said there are good reasons to keep our economic interests, economic activities alive with China. Those are all good reasons. When it comes down to it, interests, values, economics, that's not what's going to decide U.S.-China relations. It comes down to politics. We are in an era where domestic politics are determining each country's agenda. And in this particular era, when relations are so bad, what we need is leadership. And there is an absence of leadership on both sides of the Pacific. Let's begin with China. Is Li Peng a leader? It doesn't need an answer. There are good totalitarian leaders, and there are bad ones. Or should I say inept ones? And who wants to see a smart, ruthless, totalitarian leader? Look at Gorbachev's treatment of the Lithuanians. He got what he wanted, and he didn't have to kill anyone. Li Peng was simply inept. But what he did was he made things worse. We all recall that when Mao Zedong died, the Chinese people had to explain, the Chinese leaders had to explain to the Chinese people 10 years of tragedy. And how did they do it? It was the Gang of Four's fault. Well, we all knew whose fault it was. It was Mao Zedong's, but you couldn't say that. Well, now the Chinese government has to explain to its people, how do you explain June 4th? And they don't mean 2,000 dead people. They mean the fact that Tiananmen was besieged for 2 months. You blame Zhao Ziyang, but everyone knows whose fault it is. It's Deng Xiaoping's fault. 10 years of reform, economic and political reform, created an atmosphere in which students besieged and occupied Tiananmen Square. Deng Xiaoping has been crippled. We have a situation in China where there is no preeminent leader. He's not weaker than anyone else. In fact, he may still be stronger than anyone else. He may still be first among equals, but he's more equal than first. In the Chinese political system, in contrast to our own, when you have a strong leader, his foreign policy autonomy is far greater than any American president's. But when you have a weak leader, there is no leadership in foreign policy, for everyone is scrambling for position. When they scramble for position, the stakes are high, because when you lose in Chinese politics, you have a long way to fall. And so what we're seeing is a leadership vacuum. And in these circumstances, national interests, national values, that's not determining policy. What's determining policy is that leaders are appealing to constituencies in preparation for the death of these 80-year-old leaders. Troop maneuvers, air maneuvers, sea maneuvers off the coast of Fujian in the middle of a Taiwan election. Is that sound policy? No. That's Li Peng appealing to a constituency. Arms sales from the Middle East are back on the agenda. Is this a way to manage a U.S. policy? No. This is a way to appeal to a constituency. We're not going to see leadership in China until this 80-year-old generation dies. The Chinese people, Chinese leadership has a chance to sort things out, and a new leadership can emerge that has the domestic ability, the domestic strength to chart a new path. A path which, from any perspective for the Chinese people, means good relations with the United States and making costs and making sacrifices to have that relationship. Sacrifices no Chinese leader can make right now because none have the authority and the power base to take the risks. It would be nice to say that the American side's different, but it's not. Gone is the day of Henry Kissinger, Richard Nixon, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and the China relationship just took care of itself. The Russian polar bear was up there, and, well, you sweep human rights under the rug, you sweep economic differences under the rug. The domestic scene takes care of itself because everyone agrees you need to take care of China policy to deal with the Russians. It's gone. What you need in this era is management. Remember George Bush? He was supposed to be good at that. We didn't expect great ideas. We didn't expect great leadership, but he was good to be a manager. Wrong. For all his successes in dealing with Eastern Europe, where he's been able to sit back and do nothing, the one area in the world where he has to manage is China, and he's blown it. He's blown on the Chinese side because he's mismanaged Chinese domestic politics. He goes to China in February 1989 and invites Fang Lijie to a state banquet for Ronald Reagan's support for Russian dissidents. He had the sense to meet them in the embassy. Bush should support Chinese dissidents, but he shouldn't provide ammunition for, quote, the bad guys in Chinese politics to dump on U.S.-China relations. And that's what he did. Compound things, and he mismanages American domestic politics. For all of Henry Kissinger's duplicity, for all of his secret foreign policy, Henry Kissinger never lied to Congress. You do not lie to Congress if you want a successful foreign policy, because you're guaranteed to undermine whatever support or legitimacy you have. And when George Bush said, we will have no further exchanges, high-level exchanges with the Chinese leadership, you can differentiate between contact and exchanges all you want. It's irrelevant. The American people heard George Bush say there would be no high-level contacts. That's what mattered, and we often had them. That did two things. One, when you got a president at 70% popularity rate, Democrats are going to look for anything they can get. And there was a president lying, and they jumped right into the fray. And they've been very successful at it. They've found something George Bush is weak on. And they're not going to let go. Why should they? Second, you've had important senators and congressmen, representatives, stake out a position on this. And it's not easy to back down on a position of this profile. I think Steve Solars right now can say, I was wrong about China and George Bush was right. It can happen. Second, what it did is it undermined the American people's confidence that George Bush could manage China policy in accordance with both American values and American interests. So there's a sense of legitimacy out there. Someone else does need to rein in George Bush to check his credentials. Now what happened is George Bush went to the mat for China. He wanted to maintain control of China policy, to keep student immigration visas under his control. And he went to the mat and he won. But he paid a high political price. He used a lot of capital. In retrospect, it probably wasn't worth it. Well, he's got another battle coming up, and that's, as Martin said, it's MFN. There's a lot of good reasons to keep MFN. But I'm not sure that this president's going to do it. It's bad enough to be your own China desk officer. Look at the mess he got into. It's worse when you have a politician running foreign policy. And by that I mean the Secretary of State, James Baker. We all know his tactics. His eyes on the next election. Put your finger in the air, which way is the wind blowing, and that's the way you go. Well, what you've got coming up for June 1st on MFN is the way the White House reads it. The president, if he goes to veto, can't win. And the Democrats win all the way around. They win because they dump on China. They win because they get to dump on Bush if he tries to veto it. And they win if Bush is successful, because then they still get to trade with China. And their businesses back home don't suffer. I get the strongest feeling these days that Jim Baker doesn't like that. And the advice the president's getting is, don't go to the mat right now. Why bother? China isn't helping you out, and you're only going to help the Democrats. So what you've got in this country, again, is an absence of leadership. The president is making policy on the basis of domestic politics, not national values, not national interests, not economic interests. To untie that knot is going to take leadership on both sides. And it's far from clear we're going to see it in the immediate future.
I think the State Department will be sorry they didn't send their representative. And we will conclude with Larry Sullivan, who is a political scientist, teaches at Adelphi University, is an research associate at the Fairbanks Center for East Asian Research, writes on a wide range of topics, including foreign policy. Larry Sullivan.
Well, when I was asked to do this forum, I never thought I would be put in the position of defending George Bush. But perhaps we can outline some of the areas for possible discussion, although I'm very persuaded by my colleague, Professor Ross's analysis. I do think that what Martin Wild had to offer us on the question of World Bank loans and the way in which the administration is stuck on that, and something that I know myself independently, plus the role that the United States played at the recent Geneva review by the Commission on Human Rights of the United Nations, where the United States was not as strong as it could have been in pushing for the very mild condemnation of China, but it didn't play the kind of backseat role that I had feared. It was fairly actively involved. So I think there are areas of U.S. policy in which there has been some autonomy shown, although I do think, and I certainly would agree with him, that in the China's case, that there is a vacuum there is a sort of jockeying going on, and that has left a tremendous vacuum in a lot of these irrational actions that he mentioned, but perhaps we can discuss that in question time. I'd just like to spend a few minutes outlining what I think are some of the policy questions, really, which the Bush administration and Congress, which I do feel has a role in foreign policy, are going to have to face with China over the next few months, if not years. And one of my premises here is that I think all along many of us have argued, particularly given the geriatric age of the old leaders in China, that China is on the verge of some great change, that what happened in Eastern Europe could very quickly follow in China. And certainly one would hope so, although perhaps not down the Romanian road because of the bloodshed involved. But let me just suggest an alternate basis for looking at these policy questions, and that is not a very rapid movement on the death of the leaders, all of whom, by the way, the names that Ye-Yang mentioned, I think they're all going to die in the same week. Chen Yun's going to go on Monday, and Wang Jun's going to go on Tuesday, and Deng, well, who knows. But anyway, I still think there's a possibility that the regime structure and the policies that these eight old cadres stand for can still be continued after their death. I think that's unlikely, but I still think there is a possibility, and I think policymakers in Washington, I would hope, and that's why I wish the State Department person was here, would consider the other option from what most China specialists are saying, which is that upon Deng's death and the others, that there's going to be this rapid change back towards the kind of reform policies that we saw earlier. I think there's a chance, although I wouldn't give it 50-50, of the current regime structure, which is very repressive, very orthodox, very dogmatic in its policies. If you read the New York Times today, very anti-American, at least in its propaganda. I personally like the story in Beijing, or in People's Daily, about the dog being elected in California. I'm very proud to announce I voted for the dog. But I think given that kind of policy structure, I'm not so convinced that it's all going to disappear with the death of these old men. The leadership that at least is implementing this, if not creating it, Li Peng, Li Ximing, who in the last real vote in the Central Committee got the largest number of votes for the Central Committee. He's the first party secretary of Beijing Municipal Party Committee. And a number of other leaders that are still around may be very committed to this policy and regime structure that we now see being put into place. And so the question I think that the Bush administration has to pose is, what kind of policy does this administration pursue over the next 3 years, assuming it's around until '92, and then if it's reelected at that point, and even with a possible subsequent Baker administration. I think there are 3 or 4 areas here, or issues that the administration is going to have to look at very carefully. The first is, I think, the whole question of how the United States responds to what was alluded to earlier, and that is the possibility, and I think it's a very strong possibility, of China becoming very active again in selling missiles and other weaponry into a very volatile part of the world, and that is the Middle East. We know that Iraq, in particular, is on a buying binge of all sorts of things. It's being prevented from doing that now by the FBI and others in England, but I would not be surprised if China is carrying out negotiations at this moment to make major sales of weapons to Iraq, and we've seen what they've promised, perhaps, if they are in possession of those weapons. Without going into this in a great deal of detail, a lot of it's very technical, and I don't want to discuss it. I think that the imperative for China to become involved very actively again in missile sales is very high. And the reason for that is what Martin Weil described so carefully, and that is the economic crisis. China has a very severe foreign exchange shortage. but it has a very good and active weapons production apparatus. We've seen the other day with the launching of the satellite their capabilities in those areas. And to me, and given the kind of power constituencies that Bob Ross outlined, to me that is just a logical area to go. If you're facing very severe cash shortages with the possibility of MFN, and although I understand a lot of Martin Weil's arguments and agree with many, if not all of them, I do think that Bob perhaps is correct in his view of the politics of the situation. I think the politics here may dictate, if not a complete overturning of the MFN status of China, I at least think there has to be some movement in that area. In other words, a reduction of some MFN privileges for China, just for the Bush administration to placate the Democrats and others and to show that they're not pawns of the people in Beijing, which they've been accused of in cartoons and A.M. Rosenthal columns, etc. So given that kind of situation, and again given the power of these constituencies, and what political scientists like myself love to talk about and students like yourself hate to hear, and that is the sort of power of bureaucratic interest to dictate policy. It's not very rational, it doesn't make sense, you can't fit it into a nice logical structure, but oftentimes that indeed tends to determine what governments do. And I just think the attraction of this is too great. The current leadership in China, particularly with Bush sticking tough on World Bank loans, which I think he must, probably is arguing, particularly the hardliners, that the United States has gone by the way of the Europeans and those other crazy Democrats and propounders of bourgeois liberalism, and that therefore this promise that was very vague a few months ago to either the first or second Scowcroft-Eagleburg mission, that there would not be weapons sales in the Middle East, which the Chinese already seem to be retreating from. I think we're going to see additional problems in that area. The second policy issue Martin Weil described, that is this whole question of MFN, and I won't get into that in too much detail. I just simply would like to say that I think it's a very difficult issue. No one likes to see the United States pursuing policies that would lead to large-scale unemployment, particularly in the southern parts of China, and the economic consequences that can bring about. All I would say here is, though, that we've done it in other areas. We harmed for over a decade the economic interests of the people of Nicaragua. I don't know why Nicaraguans somehow should be subject to more severe U.S. policy than Chinese should, but they were. We've done it to the Russian people for decades because of our disagreements with internal Soviet politics and their foreign relations. And we did it with countries in Eastern Europe. I'm not advocating that we do it, but I don't think at least we should be surprised if the United States does take action in that area. MFN is not a right. It's a privilege. And I do think, particularly with what's going on in Eastern Europe, a lot of those countries are going to be asking for MFN status. A lot of these products are competitive with one another. If you can buy bunnies made in China, you can buy bunnies made in Hungary. And I think there's going to be a lot of competition in that area. And I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on the Bush administration to say, look, we should develop an economic policy that shows where we stand in the sense that Ye Yang described. And Eastern Europe has reformed. China is going the route of Kim Il-sung and Joseph Stalin, and so we shouldn't do it any big favors. But I think this is an extremely complex issue, and I hope that the Congress and the President recognize that complexity. The third issue, very quickly, is what is the U.S. reaction going to be to possible future human rights abuses? It may be occurring right now. There's reports of an uprising that's been brutally suppressed in Xinjiang province. Now, if we can get uptight and irritated by the possibility of troops being used in Lithuania, which I think we should, it's not an internal affair. Internal affairs, by the way, purely internal affairs went out with the Nuremberg trials. I think that's very clear in international law. I think we should get just upset at the butchering of Uyghurs and other Central Asian populations, even though it may not be on Ted Koppel tonight. And I think that the Bush administration is going to be under pressure to react to these human rights abuses if they can be certified. And I also think there's this problem of what our reaction is going to be to the upcoming problem, which is going to be more and more severe in the next few years, about the question of Hong Kong. I think Hong Kong is a disaster in the making. Unless the kind of changes that we've described here occur in Beijing, there's going to be enormous outflow of people or demand for outflow of people from Hong Kong. And even though Doak Barnett and others have argued that China is in favor of stability in Asia, it certainly isn't stabilizing the situation in Hong Kong. It's frightening the people there enormously, not only because of what it did in Tiananmen on June 4th, but of course the structure of the whole a law that's now been passed by the NPC. And so these are very difficult issues I've been asked to terminate, and I would hope we can discuss them.
I want to thank our panelists, and now we would like to hear from you. If you would like to ask a question, I believe you go to the microphone, state your name, who you are, and please ask your question. Do we have any questions? Yes, please go.
Hi, my name is Pei Ming-Xin. I'm a graduate student in the government department. I just want to ask a question to Mr. Whale. You raised specifically the MFN issue. I think the three arguments you presented in favor of keeping the MFN are perhaps exaggerated in their own right. The first one, you said most of the the people who would be hurt most would be private, so-called progressive forces in China. But if you look at trade figures of the Chinese government, you find that proportionally speaking, the state-owned enterprises still export 85 to 90% of the goods to China, and the hard currency that China makes is also going to the state coffers rather to the private pockets. Secondly, you said Hong Kong would be hurt. I disagree because Hong Kong's goods are not really covered on the MF treaty, and the Hong Kong people are being hurt much more severely by the political threats from Beijing rather than by the threat of revoking MFN. So I would like to ask you this question. Would you buy any goods from Nazi Germany, even if you know that they are using the Jewish labor force, they are abusing human rights, they're killing off people on the same basis of the argument that you raised? And suspiciously enough, the same arguments you raised were the same ones that were used by those people who advocated against any sanctions against South Africa. So I just don't know what's going on here.
Which I mean respond. I have to take issue with you on the points of fact about where the exports are coming from. I don't know which Chinese statistics you were referring about where exports are coming from, but I am looking at the items that are coming. I'm looking at the U.S. import statistics from China. I would say, first of all, that I would trust U.S. statistics in general a lot more than I would trust Chinese government statistics for various reasons. And I have a familiarity with the with the companies doing most of the business. And if you look at what's coming in, there are several things I'd like to point out about the numbers. And forgive me for going into detail, but since you challenged Hong Kong government statistics, of those 12 billion goods, about 8.5 billion were transshipped through Hong Kong. Not all of the goods transshipped from Hong Kong are necessarily from the private sector, but most of them probably are. And when you look at the types of goods that are coming in and you talk to the companies who are doing the business, it becomes very clear what's going on. What did China buy? What did the U.S. buy from China? Over $2.5 billion dollars worth of textiles, of which I would guess about half is from the free market part, about half is from the state sector. $1.7 billion worth of toys, close to 100% from the private sector. $700 million worth of shoes, close to 100% from the private sector. $1.6 billion of consumer electronics, I would guess 75 to 80% anyway from the private sector. I mean, if you look in detail at who is doing, I mean, $460 million of petroleum, that's the state sector. I'm not saying there is no state sector, but if you look at who's doing the business, I just have to take issue with you on the facts of where Chinese goods in the U.S. are coming from. Second, as far as the Hong Kong impact is concerned, what your argument misses is that it's not useful to think of Hong Kong and the Pearl River Delta as separate economies. For many practical purposes, they are an integrated economy. The Hong Kong companies the Hong Kong companies have left Hong Kong to manufacture in South China. I mean, according to Hong Kong government statistics, there are at least 2 million people employed by Hong Kong companies in South China in the manufacturing sector. I'm not talking about the service sector. Less than 1 million in Hong Kong. What that means is that the profitability of these companies is critically dependent on manufacturing in China. And if you I beg to differ with you that what China's done to Hong Kong is bad enough already. If you knock out the profitability of the heart of Hong Kong's manufacturing sector, that's an economic catastrophe far beyond anything that's happened, and an irresponsible thing, in my opinion, to advocate. And finally, the last point I want to make, another quick point about the Hong Kong manufacturing. I mean, a lot of the goods that come into China, that come out of China, are finished in Hong Kong, so there is some value added in Hong Kong. And some of the raw materials come from Hong Kong as well. So it's not as if there's no Hong Kong manufacturing value added. The last point about Nazi Germany, I think we all have to admit that there comes a point. I mean, I said that politics shouldn't take precedence in trade matters. There obviously comes a point when it has to. Certainly Nazi Germany in the 1930s is an example. But then one has to ask oneself, how analogous are the situations in China to the situation in Nazi Germany? And believe me, I'm not saying the situation in China is good, but I don't think one can. I don't think one should. I don't think one can compare the magnitude of the destruction and disaster to Jews in Germany to what is happening right now in China, bad though it is. And furthermore, if you decided to say that it was bad, I think you should take the implications of your argument to their conclusions. I mean, if things are that bad that one has to take a Nazi Germany solution, then we should be going to war with China.
Briefly, would you like to respond to
Yeah, just a couple of points. I also disagree with Mr. Weil about this most favored nation thing. One thing very important is when you are talking about the private sector in China, I think you should put quotation marks around the word private sector. Is there really a kind of private sector in China as it is defined in the West? I don't think that is the case. In China, so many things are still tightly under state control. And I don't think you have already got a capitalist province of Canton or whatever in province where you really have a private sector in the sense of the word as you understand it here in the United States. Everything is under state control. And one response to that recently is in the People's Congress, for this year's budget, Li Peng actually had a 15.2% increase of military spending. That comes to something like 6.1 billion American dollars. Many of those money or those wealth created by those what you call private sectors actually go into the military spending.
I want to rebut that.
All right.
I'll take 20 seconds. I'll take 20 seconds. I disagree with Mr. Ye on point of fact on the degree of state control in Guangdong province. It is certainly not free market as we understand it. Neither is Japan or Taiwan free market as we understand it here in the United States. There is government involvement, but it is local government involvement, and they operate by very different and much more liberal rules and much more market-oriented rules than Beijing. And finally, according to my understanding anyway, the foreign exchange earned by foreign-operated enterprises in Guangdong and Fujian province stays almost 100% with the enterprises.
We would like to hear a questioner, so I would ask the panelists to be brief. Mr. Baker.
Ed Baker, with Harvard Yenching Institute, and a member of the Asia Watch Committee. I thought it was quite striking that Mr. Ye referred to the Taiping Rebellion as a recent example. Might help us keep things in perspective.
We have such a long history.
His comments on the situation in Beijing made me think of one fact that stood out in my mind when I read the reports on the National People's Congress. Li Peng was quoted or paraphrased in the New York Times as saying that one of the great achievements in foreign policy this year was the improvement of relations with North Korea. And it seemed to me that he was grasping for straws. There are a lot of things I'd like to say, but I'll try to restrict myself now to speaking of the most favored nation status. And I'm not speaking for Asia Watch, because Asia Watch is still trying to make up its mind about what is admittedly an extremely complicated issue. But I'd like to suggest that the United States might adopt a policy in which the continuation of most favored nation status and other sanctions be contingent on concrete, clearly stated steps, such as, of course, now martial law has supposedly been lifted, but a true lifting of martial law. When Poland was threatened with, was sanctioned until martial law was lifted and political prisoners were released and a meaningful dialogue began with Solidarity and the other opponents of the government, they lifted martial law. But they made a sort of sham lifting of martial law, as happened in China, and the Reagan administration didn't buy it. They kept the sanctions in place until more meaningful steps were taken. An International Monetary Fund loan application was held up until 1984, when finally last two named political prisoners were released. I'd like to suggest that, the objective is not to beggar China. The objective is certainly not to hurt the working people of China or the Chinese economy, but I think that we don't have to approach this with a bulldozer when we could use a razor. And I'd like to hear reactions from members of the panel to the notion of very measured, clear, step-by-step sanctions in which, when a step is made, when something is done that meets a standard that has been suggested, then we can remove that part of the sanctions. The other point that I'd like to make to Mr. Weil's point is that if indeed these burdens will fall most heavily on the progressive part of the economy and on the people of Hong Kong, then if there are measured step-by-step sanctions laid out, then perhaps those people will be able to bring their own weight to bear in domestic debate to say to the government, look, why should we lose this when all we have to do is take these steps? Thanks.
Would someone else like to respond to this besides poor Mr. Weil? Larry.
Well, I think that, without being an advocate here, my suspicion is that that's what we're going to see, though largely I think for the political reasons that Bob mentioned. Bush is more afraid of the Democrats in Congress than he is of Li Peng. I guess my general response would be, one of the things that's disturbed me about the whole debate on China policy since June 4th is this notion that somehow all the weight of the responsibility of action is on us.
Well, I don't mean to.
No, I know you're not saying that. I know that very clearly. But I think that that's been the sense, and Merle knows this because she was on was testifying in front of Congress where a congressman said that, well, the Chinese might be irritated if we didn't send a high-level delegation to Beijing. I don't think we should be in a position of avoiding irritation of the leaders in Beijing after their army fired on our on our diplomatic compound, and their guards outside the embassy aimed guns at little children. Okay. And so I think one of the things that's, again, the issue of MFN is very complex. We can continue to talk about that. But I resent the notion it's all our responsibility. And I would agree with you here, if the Chinese leadership wants to avoid the kind of problems which a total turnover or total rejection of MFN, which, by the way, is not a sanction, is done, then the ball's in their court. And the ball's been in their court, as far as I'm concerned, certainly since the second Scowcroft-Eagleberger mission. They have done nothing. They haven't responded at all, and that's why I think when Bob said that Bush went to the mat, what did he get? He got anti-American diatribes in Li Peng's speech. There are other parts of that, too. It's all our fault.
Thank you. Bob, briefly.
Just like to follow up on something Larry said. That is that, why is it our responsibility? And in a sense, this is a tactical error on the part of the administration. If you go back to the Reagan administration, the way George Shultz managed China policy, he said, we're going to give Hu Na asylum. If you don't like it, tough. He said, we're going to allow Taiwan in the Asian Development Bank. If you don't like it, tough. And he did what he thought needed to be done, and he said, the ball's in your court. You can either deal with us under these guidelines, or you can walk. And that's simply a good negotiating tactic. What this administration has done is said, we are not going to deal with you. What it should have said is, this is what we are going to do in response, and we're ready to deal with you everywhere else. It's up to you to accept it or not.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Well, I guess I'm too Chinese to raise my hand to wait for the order, but I guess democracy means here in the United States just grab the microphone and speak. My name is Xingshan Tan, an assistant professor in political science from Cleveland State University. I guess it's just not easy to say that as some of the students, Chinese students here on TV appear saying that because of the last year's democracy movement are so strong that the Chinese government may not crack down on the demonstrations. I think the same is not that easy to predict that the Chinese leadership is weak and it might be fall apart overnight. I guess I want to just make a statement that I think the United States should fully engage in China right now in the economic, political, humanitarian arenas. I just like to concentrate on one perspective, that is from the humanitarian perspective. I guess I would agree with Martin Well's point that the most dynamic sector in China are those that benefited from reforms, and most of them actually are in the private sectors, especially in the South China. I quoted a lot in my dissertation Martin Well's statistics, and I trust his statistics simply because he has experiences in China, also has a lot of access into the U.S. information. Well, I would say that the sanctions of any sort would eventually hurt the Chinese people rather than the government. I went to China 2 days right after the July 4th and talked extensively to the professors, the people in Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou. And the almost unanimous response is that the breakoff or the exchanges by the Bush administration actually are perceived by those people actually are as hurting the Chinese people rather than the Chinese government, especially in the arena of educational exchanges, some of the economic and other cultural exchanges. I think it is easier to engage China in that kind of isolation, that you don't have to, to show your influence in China by just totally denouncing China, whatever you want to do, just like you did right after the Second World War, right after the Korean War up to the beginning of 1970s. I think it is much easier to do that way. But it is very difficult to influence China if you really engage in that kind of isolation policy. I think the United States was able to influence China since the open door policy since 1978 was the fact that the U.S. values and U.S. ideas and all these democratic ideas just went in China with these economic, political, diplomatic, cultural exchanges. Therefore, I think I know you are kind of uneasy about my long speech, but I just want to make the statement short, is that I think from the humanitarian reasons, I think it is good for the United States to engage in this policy, and I hope that the MFA status could be granted annually.
Good. We will get a brief response from Bob Ross and then Ye.
Somewhat sympathetic with that comment, and I'd like to draw the audience's attention to what we used to call the Sullivan Principles. If you're going to trade with South Africa, these are the rules you ought to follow. And the idea was, following these certain rules, you would benefit or contribute to the end of apartheid. There ought to be a set of Sullivan Principles for China. And I would commend to Asia Watch that might be a way to go. If you want to trade with China, private sector, not the state. This industry, not the other. And you can easily differentiate what contributes to spiritual pollution and what doesn't.
Yeah, I'm grateful.
Yes, I understand that kind of feeling as this person just mentioned, but I also have some questions. You mentioned that everyone you met unanimously. I think it still depends on what kind of people you met there, because I have heard many people telling me just to the contrary. So it's hard to say. Also, you went back just 1 month after the massacre, and I'm not in the position to go back 1 month after that.
Somebody tells me there are people up there and there's someone down here, and we are told to finish at 9:25. So what I would like to suggest is we will try to get the people that are at the microphones. If you would state your points briefly, we will answer briefly, please.
Mr. Yi, the United States has a president whose brother has a lucrative consulting contract developing a space satellite for China. He has a Secretary of State who's a personal crony and politically ambitious. He's appointed many diplomats and ambassadors who are political contributors. There are people in the U.S. government that seem to be mainly concerned about selling cigarettes overseas and Pepsi-Cola. Should we act on human rights? What should the priorities be? But on the other hand, we want, I understand that the Chinese people have a diet currently averaging about 2,000 calories a day. A lot of people, I know scientists who are interested in things like pandas and saving forests and things like that. Should we go for broke and really work for change, or should we try some accommodation to think of the welfare of these people? And how can we ascertain the will of the Chinese people? I assume the will of the Chinese people is different from their government. Our media tell us that the sentiment of certainly of students in this country, and to the extent that they can ascertain it over there, is that many Chinese people would like to see the United States take a strong stand for human rights. But how can we verify that that is what the Chinese people mostly want?
Thank you. Larry, would you like to respond?
Who knows the will of the Chinese people will be spoken when they have free elections. I would just take you to the situation recently in Nicaragua, where even ABC News was predicting a strong Ortega victory. Every poll showed that Ortega would win, but when Nicaraguan people had a chance to vote, Ortega didn't win. The second thing I would point out is that I think we overemphasize our impact on democratization, the drive for democratization in China and other parts of the world. We have almost no impact culturally or politically in Mongolia. Wait, let
Larry finish, please.
Let me finish. I just want to say the point. I think we overemphasize our impact one way or the other.
All right, thank you. Continue, Larry.
And I think we've seen with the move towards reform and democratization in countries that have very little Western impact, like Mongolia, Bulgaria, and now even perhaps, hopefully, Albania, where they've been isolated, shows that you don't have to be influenced by Western goods or even Western ideas to want control over your life.
Thank you, Larry. We will. Is there someone up there that I can't really see because the lights are shining? If not, we will conclude with your question.
Okay. My name is Oscar Hsu, and I'm an undergraduate at Harvard University. To make my position very clear, it probably might help the panel to know that I'm one of the leaders of the Harvard Students for a Democratic China. So perhaps that will indicate my orientation and my bias on any questions I may give. It was traditional in China, at least, for students to be actively involved in intellectual and political discussion. And I'm well aware that on government and administrative levels, student views aren't often held to be very worthy or meritorious. But to continue in the Chinese tradition, I would like to express some of my reactions, and particularly to ask Brian Ross a few questions. I sense some sympathy perhaps between my points of view. I would just like to probe that with some of my reactions, speaking as a student, and hopefully being able to learn. It seems to me, from listening to the presentation of the U.S. and China Economic Council, that the United States foreign policy is purely a profit-oriented, profit-motivated economic policy. I also heard it asserted that the United States probably would have little to lose from pulling out its resources and from its economic transactions with China, and that certainly both Professor Sullivan and Ross understand that the State Department has done very little to slap the hands, let's say, of those dinosaurs in Beijing. Now, given the fact that I understand you want to depoliticize socialist economics, but knowing that the United States would have very little to lose, and that very little has been done politically. Would not some form of economic sanctions be a wonderful or actually practical way to make a strong political statement of our outrage towards the massacre? And would it not also be wise to do that because of hastening the economic and political downfall of the current geriatric generation and establish a more stable and secure economic system of ties with the future of China, with the next generation? Now, I'm not sure whether I presented myself very clearly.
You did very fine.
Clearly.
Yes. Martin, you may please do so.
First of all, I mean, I really want to be very brief because I think I've already made the points. The most effective economic sanctions of all are already in place. I mean, the sanctions that businessmen themselves are putting on China out of their own evaluations of the business and political climate. There are also de facto government economic sanctions in the form of the cutoff of most kinds of U.S. government aid and the very sharp cutoff of the of the World Bank loans, which is already, I think, a part of the scalpel approach that was advocated by the part of Asia Watch. I'll leave it at. I mean, I've stated my case already. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. All right. Our last question. I promise you. Go ahead.
My
please,
question
briefly.
is directed to Mr. Ye. As you mentioned that you are quite sure that Chinese government has been pursuing a kind of proliferations of nuclear arms. And my question is that, your conviction might be quite important since, the fourth review conference of nuclear non-proliferation treaty, NPT, is due to begin this coming August. So your conviction should be quite significant. So what I mean that how can you be so sure that Chinese government has been pursue that kind of proliferation? I mean, nuclear arms, not missile. We know missile quite well since the Chinese government sold missile to Saudi Arabia. And if you get your information from NYT, I don't think it's quite convincing. I hope that you get information from behind the bamboo curtains. Would you please give me a little
let me tell you what, I didn't say I was sure of the proliferation. I said America, the United States, has national interests in engaging China in important issues like the proliferation of nuclear arms. That's exactly what I said. And when I said that, I was quoting the testimony of Lawrence Eagleburger before the Congress. He said that we have to hold this dialogue with China because we need to have talk with them in such and such issue. I was just quoting Eagleburger. That's not mine.
I want to thank all of you. I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank the audience. There is a reception afterwards. They'd be very happy to answer more of your questions. And thank you very much.